Good morning, Dan and Amy. So, Amy, we had that House Democrat sit-in that came to an end yesterday.
Finally, our long national nightmare is over.
As Wall Street Journal offered this morning, from the campus left to Black Lives Matter to Occupy Wall Street to the union activists who took over the Wisconsin legislature in 2011, modern progressives are committed to protest politics. They'll achieve their demands not democratically, but by disrupting civic order and breaking norms and laws. Now these tactics have been imported to the U.S. Congress. Well, I disagree with that a little bit. They haven't really been imported to the U.S. Congress. It's just the professional agitators were imported to U.S. Congress. The 60s refugees are now your House Democrat caucus, and so they're just doing what they've been doing for the last 45 years. They're the original cry bullies, and that was on full display in the last 24 hours as they were sitting in for, as one op-ed writer for Reason magazine wrote, sitting in for secret lists in a police state. Questions about the problems with due process or the lack thereof with what the Democrats have proposed, and some Republicans, like Mark Kirk, have signed on to. But then there's this as well, just a factor in the whole discussion. They don't really hate guns, the left. They just hate guns in the hands of private law-abiding citizens. And to my point, the story that comes to us from the Washington Free Beacon, there are now more than 200,000 non-military federal officers with arrest and firearm authority, surpassing the 182,000 personnel currently actively serving in the U.S. Marine Corps. We have more armed individuals with arrest authority in agencies like the IRS and the EPA, add them all up, north of 200,000 as compared to the U.S. Marine Corps.
Which has how many? 185?
182,000. So you're talking about the IRS agents with the AR-15s and the EPA administrators wearing camouflage, the militarization of federal regulatory agencies. U.S. Department of Education has a SWAT team. Can anyone tell me why? No.
What, to protect Arnie Duncan? Oh, he's gone.
But so
that's so strange.
So it's very interesting. So it's just worth noting there is not this this have a Coke and a smile policy that the left promotes with respect to guns. It exempts the federal government. It exempts the state. Always remember that, because they're agents of the state. And the lead agent of the state, one of the lead agents of the state, particularly a bigger state, a totalitarian state, I'd suggest, she is Jan Schakowsky. She's a long-serving communist member of Congress from the near north suburbs. Her husband's a convicted felon, Bob Kramer.
Yeah, what did Bob Kramer do again? I forget.
Check kiting. And Jan Schakowsky at least intentionally admitted that their anti-gun theater over the last 24 hours was just that, theater.
I've seen interviews on television where the interviewers say, well, if this no-fly, no-buy, if terrorists were, people on the watch list couldn't get guns, that would not have solved the problem. If there had been a background check, universal background checks, that wouldn't have solved this particular incident. We know that.
Right. We know that.
Yeah, and you know that because you just admitted it.
We know that.
So why are you doing what you're doing?
The things that we want to do, we know won't solve any of the problems. We're doing them for show. Thank you for that admission, Jan Schakowsky, who, by the way, took time out of emailing fundraising solicitations to offer those remarks on the House floor in violation of House Ethics Committee rules. Jan Schakowsky sent a message to supporters while on the House floor using the left-wing fundraising platform Act Blue to demagogue and boogeyman the NRA and to try and raise money for her and her colleagues.
Did Debbie Wasserman Schultz do the same thing while she was under her little blankie? Because she was on there, nodding off and texting rapidly and trying to Periscope and Facebook Live what was going on.
It's a real collection.
Yeah.
All right. Well, for more on the topic of anti-gun theater, as well as we'll get his reaction to the latest acquittal in the Freddie Gray related cases, we're now joined by our friend Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark. Sheriff Clark, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Glad to be with you, Dan. Amy, how are you?
Good. So the Democrats sit-in yesterday, or into yesterday, started the day before, because they want people on the, well, I'll just use the sloganeering, no fly, no buy. What'd you make of it?
The theater that you're going to get, it's a head fake done by the Democrats, as they always do. When one of these tragic situations happens, this terror attack down in Orlando committed by a radical Islamic terrorist. And what they do is they go into all this theater about all these other things. It's these shiny objects to try to get us off of what we really should be talking about. And, to be honest with you, they're pretty good at it, because for 2 solid weeks I listened to everybody talking about gun control. It's not gun control. It's not a gun issue. That stuff's all true. But like I said, that's done to deflect away from the fact that we have a growing problem in this country with radical Islamic terrorism.
Okay, so as a law enforcement officer, what do you suggest to try and stop mass shootings, if even that is at all possible?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're a target-rich environment. We're an open society. We want to keep it that way. But there are ways that we can be more effective. And I think when 49 Americans are slaughtered in a terrorist attack, it's not too critical to look at our institutions that are responsible for that and start to peel back the layers, drill down into it, and find out what happened. In this case, the FBI dropped the ball, plain and simple. This guy was, and they like to use this phrase because we heard it after Boston bombing, we heard it after Fort Hood, we heard it after San Bernardino, now we're hearing it again. This guy was on our radar screen, whatever that means. And then they conducted this lengthy investigation, and I've maintained it's the wrong agency to do domestic intelligence in the United States. They're not structured to do intelligence. They don't understand the process. They're an investigative agency. They go out and look for probable cause to make an arrest to get someone criminally charged. That's not intelligence work. Intelligence works to identify the threats, find out their capabilities, and determine if they're planning an attack. And if they would have done that in San Bernardino, if they would have done that in Boston, if they would have done that in Fort Hood with Nidal Hassan, if they would have done that in Orlando, they would have seen the red flags were all over the place. The system was blinking red. They would have connected the dots, and they could have interrupted that situation there. So I maintain it is not possible to stop all terror attacks. I'll give you a quick example. In Philadelphia, when a lone guy went out, fired shots inside a squad car in the name of Allah at a Philadelphia police officer, those are very difficult to stop. But these acts that I just described took planning. They took long-term planning to pull them off. And I think that if you're more effective if you understand the intelligence process and what it is, you can disrupt, detect, and deter these events before they happen, because that is the philosophy of a true intelligence agency like MI5 in the UK.
Let me ask you an operational question, because there's been some talk about FBI resources. That's an issue with the number of investigations that they have to follow up on and so forth. And apparently, I think they're about the size of the Chicago Police Department. So that's not a lot of agents for a big, diverse, free country, as you're describing. But one of the questions is about how the FBI interacts with local law enforcement. So, for example, in the Orlando shooter case, if they don't have the resources to follow up, say, for example, when a gun shop owner calls them and says, I got a guy that came into my shop, didn't like the vibe, made a call talking in Arabic, I shut him down, didn't sell him anything. Maybe somebody should come over here and check out my surveillance video in the store and see if this guy is a larger problem. And if the FBI can't do that, they don't have the resource to do that. What about outsourcing that to the local police departments to be partners in trying to interdict terrorism?
Well, sure. And in fairness to the FBI, their hands are tied, because even when they get that information, there's only so much they can do. But they're out looking for, if they were to get that call, their first thought is, was a law violated here? And that's not what intelligence work is. So I don't think this is a manpower or human resource situation, if you will. There's a disconnect. But in fairness to them, their hands are tied, because the Obama administration will not allow them to do some of the things that we have to do within the law, by the way, to develop warnings intelligence, to preempt these attacks before they happen. They have to quickly determine is there probable cause to make an arrest, or they have to go out and try to sell someone who doesn't have the capability. Remember, I said you want to identify the threats, determine their capabilities, and figure out if they're planning an attack. And the guy doesn't have the capability. He might be a threat, so they go out and they try to sell him guns. If the guy buys guns, then they go out and arrest him. Okay, yeah, that looks good for the cameras, but that's not intelligence work. So we have to untie the hands of our law enforcement agencies at the federal level. That is not going to happen unless we get a new president, and unless we get the right president. That's not likely to happen. So, the resource thing, well, I think they're going about it wrong anyway, and there is a disconnect between what you're saying, Dan, and local law enforcement. But we somewhat have that same problem on our end, that we have this mindset of looking for probable cause to make an arrest. Once a guy's on your radar screen, he can never go off the radar screen. They close his case out as inconclusive. They spent too long investigating, and what I mean by that is, once it's an intelligence case, that goes on forever, and an analyst will make determinations as time goes on. For instance, the example you gave, the guy goes out, he's trying to buy some ballistic armor. He's already been on the radar screen. That's a red flag, okay? You don't jump out to make an arrest. But now you can look and say, this guy now is gathering the capability. It is time to move in and disrupt this thing. That's the guy whose emails you want to monitor under court order. That's the guy whose text messages, whose credit card charges you want to monitor instead of every American like they were doing with the collection of metadata. They weren't monitoring our text messages and emails, but they were collecting that data and saving it for I don't know why. So really this is in my estimation, and I studied this stuff. I have a graduate degree in security studies, Homeland Security related, from the U.S. Naval Academy Postgraduate School. Doesn't make me an expert, but I've done some research. I understand. I've looked at how they do this in Israel. I've looked at how in comparative governments, how they do intelligence in the UK. They have more experience at this terror stuff than we have. This is kind of new to us. We ought to take lessons from them, but sometimes the arrogance gets in the way. We're the best. We're second to none. Well, we got to get rid of that mindset and start focusing on disrupting, deterring, and preventing these attacks well before they happen.
It's an interesting perspective. That's very good. Before we let you go, though, I want to ask you about the Freddie Gray case that was adjudicated yesterday. Another of the officers that was indicted, this officer, Goodson, facing the most serious charges, and he's acquitted on all charges in a bench trial. Your reaction to that acquittal and just more generally the prosecution of the officers in that case?
Well, justice was served. The people down in Baltimore were looking for justice. They got it yesterday. Justice is due process. Due process was granted to Freddie Gray. Due process was granted to the police officer down there. Another swing and a miss by State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, who's been an embarrassment. I think that the Maryland Bar ought to investigate her, and if it rises to that level, suspend her law license. She's incompetent. She weaponized the prosecutor's office to go on a political witch hunt to try to hang some of Baltimore's finest. She ought to go into court today, as soon as it opens, and ask a judge to release all of these charges on the remaining officer, including the first one that ended in a hung jury. Because every time one of these trials happens, the good people of Baltimore have to relive this nightmare all over again. She promised something she could not deliver, and now it's time to put this ugly chapter behind and let the good people of Baltimore move on with their lives, and let these law enforcement officers resume their careers and get on with their lives, minus Marilyn Mosby, minus the mayor, Rawlings Blake, and they ought to offer an apology, not just to these six, but to the entire Baltimore Police Department.
No words minced there. He is Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke. Sheriff Clarke, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
It's always my pleasure. You guys have a good weekend.
You too. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.